Hello, I'm Will Stevens and I work on data for the recovery trial of COVID-19 treatments in the UK. So first of all, a little bit about my background. I've worked in software development in industry and academia for 25 years. About half of that has been spent working on clinical trials. And more recently, I've been working on software to support the CDRC, SDTM and ADaM standards. And I've been involved in the CDRC UK network, the CDRC European Coordinating Committee, and also more recently the Real World Data Expert Advisory Board. I'll say something about the recovery trial. So this trial was set up in the UK at the end of February, beginning of March 2020, when it became apparent that we were going to have the COVID epidemic in this country. And it's a randomized controlled trial of treatments for COVID-19. Participants are hospitalized COVID patients, and they're randomized to one of a number of possible treatments. The trial is ongoing at the moment, and there are more than 16 treatments available in the trial, or have been over the past year and a half. So the first participant was randomized on the 19th of March 2020, just when the first wave was beginning here in the UK, and the primary outcome is 28-day mortality. In the first couple of months, the trial recruited over 10,000 participants, and to date has recruited over 44,000. In June 2020, less than 3 months after starting, the trial was able to show that dexamethasone reduced mortality, and later on showed that tocilizumab and Regencov also have an effect on hospitalized participants with COVID-19. Importantly, the trial also showed that a number of treatments didn't have any effect. Here's a chart and a graph showing the coverage of recruitment into the trial in the UK and the recruitment rate from March 2020 until the beginning of November this year. You can see that the recruitment rate follows the pattern of the waves of the pandemic in the UK. The data in the recovery trial is mapped to the CDRC, SDTM and ADaM standards. And the aim here is to make the data ready to share and ready for regulators as soon as possible. The challenges in doing that have been working out how to map data from multiple different sources to SDTM. And I'll say more about the different data sources in a few slides' time. And then working out exactly what the regulators need to see. Another challenge has been, because we have data from several different providers, getting the data sharing agreements in place, working out what we can share from each of the different providers and what the process is for sharing the data. So the data sources that we have are a web-based CRF using Open Clinica that's completed by investigators in the hospitals where the patients are recruited. We also have data from several electronic data sources. There are 16 data sources in total, 17 including the CRF. The electronic data sources are pre-processed by a data engineer when they're received by recovery to extract only the data that's relevant to recovery and do some basic standardization of dates and variable names. That's quite a large piece of work. So data extracts are received at the height of the pandemic. They were received on a weekly basis. So this had to be this pre-processing step had to be carried out every week. The data quality and completeness from each source varies. I'll say more about that, how that's handled in a minute. We also have different pieces of information about the same outcomes from each source. As I've said, the primary outcome is 28-day mortality. We also look at time to discharge from hospital, use of ventilation, use of renal replacement therapy, and some other pieces of data. The complete CRF and statistical analysis plan are available on the Recovery website. Here are some examples of the data sources that are used for death date. So one is the personal demographics service, which is the first indication that we get that somebody has died, and a death date may appear in this source just a few days after death. And initially it might be out by a day or two and then be corrected later on. And there's a flag to indicate whether it should be regarded as completely reliable or not. We also get death from the civil registration dataset, which covers everybody in England and Wales. This also includes the cause of death, but there's a lag on that dataset, so the coverage is incomplete for people who died recently. The CRF that's completed in hospital also captures in-hospital deaths and also a higher level cause of death classification. And in total, we have 10 different data sources that could contain death date for all the countries in the UK. We have a couple of documents related to the data sources. So one document describes which data sources we use and why they were chosen, and what their coverage, what their geographical coverage is, and so on. Then we have another document describing in detail how data from these sources is mapped to SDTM and ADaM, and that refers to the outcomes defined in the statistical analysis plan. And this slide shows the kind of outline of how the data from these sources is mapped to, restarting this slide. This slide shows in outline how the data from these sources is mapped to SDTM. So for the death data, how do we deal with disagreement between different data sources? We have some data sources, such as the civil registration death data, which are regarded as the gold standard for this data, but they have a time lag. So we need more up-to-date data to be able to evaluate quickly the effects of treatment. We can compare the other data sources to this gold standard data source to get an estimate for how reliable they are, and then rank the data sources in order of reliability and preferentially pick the most reliable. But if the most reliable isn't available, pick the next reliable, and so on. And even the least reliable sources that we have are better than having no data at all. And typically, where there is disagreement, it's usually only by a couple of days. We work out completeness of follow-up from the CRFs and electronic healthcare data. Some of the data sources give us hospital admission and discharge date, and we can assume that if an event happens in between those dates, then we'll find out about that event from that data source. And we found that the completeness for the primary and secondary outcomes is greater than 99%. During the course of recovery, we've thought about electronic healthcare data systems and the attributes that they could have that would make them more suitable for use in clinical trials. One of these is making sure that you can always access the data as it was at a point in time in the past. And the type of scenario where this is useful is if for example, you're looking at one of the publications in 5 years' time, and you want to be able to trace a data point back to all of the data items that contributed to it. If the data sources have this property, then that would become possible. You could say, you could query the data source and say, what was the data like for this participant 5 years ago, say. Another issue is working out whether, if you don't find an event in a data source, does that mean that the event didn't happen, or does it mean that the participant has no data in that data source? On a previous slide, I showed that if we have admission and discharge date from a given source, then we expect to find out about an event that happened between those 2 dates. Another thing that helps is to standardize the data in some way. That could either be done by the data provider or as a separate layer by a separate group applying standardization across multiple different data sources. Another couple of issues relate to how should this information about where the data came from be presented to users of the data, including regulators. And it would be useful to have a template for describing data sources, describing the attributes that the data sources have. So, for example, what the original purpose of the data source was, what its geographical coverage is, what time period it covers, what's the expected lag time between something happening to a participant and that event appearing in the data source, and also how was the data entered. Typically, there'll be quite a large data entry manual, but if you're only using some of the data from that source, then you could have a cut down version, an easier to understand version of a description of how the data was entered. And also, just as you have annotated CRFs describing how data from the CRF maps to CDISC SDTM, you can imagine it would be useful to have a template describing how data from each of these electronic sources is mapped to SDTM. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for having this opportunity to tell you about what we've done in recovery, and I look forward to hearing all the other presentations.